Three preliminary options for South Africa's electoral system have emerged from the Electoral Reform Consultation Panel. Now, the panel is reviewing South Africa's electoral system, and for more on the Electoral Reform Consultation Panel, we are now joined by the member, Dr. Albertus Schoeman. He joins us now via our video link. Dr. Albertus, thank you so much for your time this evening here on SABC News. Now, you've met over 2 days to discuss the country's electoral reforms, and you've concluded that there are 3 options when it comes to the options or the preliminary options that South Africa has. Maybe if you can just start off by taking us through some of the outcomes from that conference.
Thank you, Mbali. Thank you so much for having me, and good evening to your viewers. So we've just had our final public engagement this week. Over the last 3 or 4 months, the ERCP has been traveling around the country, hearing from the public what they want out of an electoral system. We've been doing our research, and this week we met with political parties, civil society organizations, and members of the public to indicate some of the preliminary findings that we've come across in terms of the 3 options, as you've mentioned. One of these is largely in line with the current framework that we have in South Africa for elections, where we would retain the 9 regional constituencies that we currently have, but we would introduce some small changes to the way in which seats are distributed to exclude political parties and independent candidates that don't receive a full quota of the vote. So essentially, those extremely small cases where a political party enters parliament based on less than a remainder of a vote. The second option would reduce the constituencies that we have at the regional level currently. So there would be something along either the district lines that we have at the local government level or a combination of municipalities. And this would, again, have something compensatory to restore overall proportionality. Our third option introduces single-member constituencies, and this would work something like we currently have at the local government level in local elections. We have both a ward councillor, but also party list candidates.
And Dr. Albertus, why was it necessary to hold this conference and to look at the country's electoral reforms?
So this whole process was originally initiated by some of the constitutional court rulings that we had a few years ago around independent candidates, and this re-sparked this conversation around electoral reform in South Africa. And so when those changes were made ahead of our last election, there was a specific clause for the establishment of the Electoral Reform Consultation Panel to consider potentially additional reforms to the system. And that's something that we've been looking at since our appointment last year, May. And part of our mandate in terms of the legislation is to consult with the public, to research, to investigate, and to prepare recommendations for Parliament on the possible options, but also to look at the reasons for each of these options. What would their advantages, disadvantages be, but also what kind of legal, constitutional implications they might have, and what would the financial costs of these new systems be.
And would you say that some of the conversations which were had over 2 days were robust and, are also in a good way to sort of iron out some of the difficulties that we face as a country when it comes to our electoral reforms?
I think we've had an excellent public engagement so far. When we first issued our written call for submissions, we had over 348 civil society organizations, parties, ordinary citizens writing into us. And so I think we've been very excited about that. And even with our conference this past week, in the end, we had to bring in extra chairs to the venue because we had such a large turnout. And I think we were quite fortunate to have the Portfolio Committee for Home Affairs there as well, who have engaged quite thoroughly and were asking questions about some of the options to understand what the implications are. And I think all of the political parties have really come to the table. Civil society are very engaged. A lot of them have come up with their own research and proposals. And I think that really helps to hold us accountable, but also to learn from the public's knowledge and the expertise of, for example, academics, but also to hear what the public is interested in terms of an electoral system.
And I mean, you know, your work doesn't end here, right? You still need to go to Parliament to present to them in terms of the electoral systems that you've looked into. When can we expect that to take place?
So this is our last moment where we'll engage with the public. At this point, we're finished with our public consultations and we'll start preparing our final report. This is going to be quite a large task, and we currently have until the end of August to prepare our final report. We're hoping that it will be finalized before then. Once that's done, we'll submit this to the Minister of Home Affairs. Within 30 days, he'd have to table it in Parliament, and then the Portfolio Committee for Home Affairs, they themselves would have to go through a legislative process to change the law, and in that case, it would also allow for another round of public consultations and inputs on the legislation that gets drafted. And so I think it's an important point to emphasize that it's not the Electoral Reform Panel that will make the final decision, but that this is ultimately the purview of Parliament to determine what would be most appropriate for South Africa. But what we can do as a panel is to convey public's opinion to them and share the best available research and evidence to help guide their decision making.
Dr. Albertus, thank you so much for your time. That's Dr. Albertus Schoeman there. He is a member of the Electoral Reform Consultation Panel, and they've been holding engagements over the past 2 days looking at the country's electoral system.